I mean, what's Pro Football Focus doing? Last week they had Brady. This week they got Brady.
We're literally doing it differently from everybody else.
As a matter of fact, moving forward from this point on, I will not make reference to PFF.
Ready to get into it?
Yeah.
All right. We're going team by team.
I would be very careful about slings.
Am I going to get sued?
You got legal on this?
Let's send you out on the right note. PFF sucks. Have a great day, everybody.
Wow.
Welcome into the PFF NFL podcast. Steve Palazzolo, Sam Monson, live on YouTube. We apologize for being a little tardy on this Monday morning, Sam.
Yeah. Sometimes the computer decides it's just not going to work. You got to reboot the thing. You got to go through the whole process. It's like being on dial-up internet back in 1997.
Wow. Shots fired at the studio. But here we are. And we're gonna keep it tight here today somehow. We're talking best rosters in the NFL, Sam. We got an article over at PFF.com. We're going to be breaking it all down. We're going to give our own top fives here.
Sure.
Anyway, Jim Wyman, Dalton Wasserman, shout out to those guys. A lot of time and effort ranking the rosters over at PFF.com. We'll break down how they ranked them and also, give our takes and maybe even give our own top five best rosters heading into the 2024 season. But first, as a busy parent, you want to give your kids a head start in their financial future, but investing can often be both confusing and time-consuming. Well, Fabric by Gerber Life makes it easy for you to set up an investment account for your child that grows with them and helps prepare for their financial future. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial health. With a UGMA account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. UGMA stands for Uniform Gifts to Minors Act. So while your kids can't invest while they're minors, a UGMA account allows you to invest on their behalf and gives their investments more time to grow. So join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. That's meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. Portfolio is managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Monthly minimum contribution required. Learn more at meetfabric.com. All right, Sam, let's go through the roster rankings. Do you want to highlight the bottom of the list first, and then we'll work our way to the top? Just get that out of the way.
Whatever way you want to do it, Steve.
Thanks. All right, let's go to the bottom. Somebody has to be last.
Yeah, I let you set the direction.
It's optimism season.
Optimism season.
So let's give an optimistic spin on the teams that are ranked last.
All right.
Denver. All right, let me know out of this. This is the list, PFF.com. Let me know where you agree in this bottom five. Denver Broncos are 32. New York Giants are 31. Carolina Panthers are 30. New England Patriots are 29. And the Arizona Cardinals are 28 in the roster rankings. Your thoughts?
So my initial thought is, wow, that's harsh on Denver. But it definitely, when we've been doing the whole offseason thing, every time I fire up that Denver depth chart, I'm like, wow, this really isn't the team that it used to be a couple of years ago. Like, this is not a good-looking roster. The offensive line, where they threw so many resources recently, still doesn't look great. Like, Garrett Bowles at left tackle is a really good, solid player. Quinn Miners at guard had a real breakout season last year. If he's still that guy going forward, then, that's 2/5 of your offensive line in really good shape. Mike McGlinchey's fine at right tackle. He's a capable, good starter. The other two spots, though, now look like potential problems. Ben Powers, Luke Wattenberg, or Sam Mustafa, or whoever you're going to put in there at center. So 2/5 of your offensive line isn't in great shape. The wide receiver room, which a couple of years ago looked so strong, is Cortland Sutton sort of, not quite becoming the player maybe that he was supposed to become, and a sort of long-term trade candidate maybe. Your guy Tim Patrick coming off injury. Marvin Mims, who's the offseason hype guy every year. Are we going to get more of him this year, or is he just going to be, that guy every year? And then, obviously the rookie Troy Franklin, the fourth rounder. But it's not like that's a group where you're going, this is amazing. This is, high level. The defense is like Patrick Surtain, and then all the good players have gone. Like, it's not a good roster.
Here's how I like to soften things. During optimism season here, we got big week of hype this week, Sam. Mini camp. We are finally to mini camp. And so there'll be plenty of, hype videos and swing passes that come from the the main team accounts, hyping things up. I like to soften it by saying question marks. These teams just have more question marks.
A lot of question marks.
And so when it comes to the Broncos, remember how bad their defense was through about 6 weeks last year? Like historically bad. How much do you weigh that? They absolutely turned a corner, started playing better. They turned the corner as a season, but a lot of that was turnover laced, right? They had a bunch of games with 3 and 4 turnovers. We know that tends to regress back, and that's what happened with Denver. So yeah, as we're looking at the depth chart, you've got all the question marks you mentioned at receiver. The offensive line that you mentioned is probably their biggest strength. I mean, that was in the graphic while you were talking. Probably their biggest strength out of this whole thing, and that's part of the issue, right? Questions at receiver, questions rushing the passer, and then questions on the back end outside of Patrick Surtain on defense. So, and then all of that added up to your quarterback as well. Bo Nix, QB6 as a rookie, right? And so a lot of these teams are going to have quarterback questions combined with some of the lack of depth here for the Broncos. That said, I would still probably put the Cardinals lower, maybe. I know Kyler's back, but
right. So I will say, I know we did this maybe last year, the year before, and I remember thinking this at the time, like, you go back a while and you could find rosters that were like miserable looking. You know what I mean? Like teams that were just terrible. There's nothing going for this team. There's zero talent on this roster. They've torn everything down. There's nothing left. This is the worst roster in the NFL, and it's not even close. And like along with the sort of offseason trends of, teams are not doing as many crazy things in free agency with their money. They're not doing as many crazy things in the draft as they used to be. Like this sort of general perception that teams are getting better at just football, like the NFL, the cycle. They're just getting better at knowing what they're doing. I think that translates to these roster rankings as well. Like my initial reaction is to look at that and go, there's no way Denver has the worst roster in the NFL. And then you sort of unpick it and you go, okay, yeah, it's not a good roster and blah, but it's not terrible. Like, as you said, as much as the offensive line is a concern, it's 3/5 fine, right? The wide receiver room isn't what it used to be. On the other hand, Cortland Sutton is fine. Tim Patrick, if he comes back, is useful. We really like Troy Franklin, what he could be. The backfield has got talent. Like, there's bits and pieces you can pick out of that and say, there's stuff to work with here. And Arizona, you mentioned them as a potential candidate. I mean, Arizona, Kyler Murray, Marvin Harrison, Michael Wilson, that backfield of James Conner and Trey Benson, the other rookie, Greg Dortch, Trey McBride. Like, there's a lot of talent on that team. I think we've run out of teams now where or just teams are no longer awful at this. Like, you're just not going to get the bottom end of these rankings every year is not going to look just a never-ending stretch of misery. There's going to be some talent there.
No, I agree. We've said that the last couple of years here on the podcast. It's a zero-sum game at the end of the day, though. Like, somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. Somebody has to be ranked
right
32nd. But that's a good way of softening the blow there, Sam, as well. Just saying, everybody's good. All the rosters are good. But you're right. I mean, it was easy to pick Arizona. I assume they were 32nd last year when we were talking through this. It was easy to pick Arizona last year because they had Kyler Murray hurt and they were legitimately going into a rebuild. But you're right. They're back on track. I think why Arizona would be competing here, though, is the defense, right? There's still so many questions on that side of the ball for the Cardinals and in important spots. Rushing the passer and just their secondary generally outside of Budda Baker. So I think Arizona is still somewhat in the running. I think the Patriots being in the running also kind of makes sense. We've made the point that, hey, Drake May stepping into the situation that kind of got Mac Jones kicked out of town, minus Bill Belichick. And then the defense last year, remember, they went on this historic run where they couldn't score points, but the defense was also on a historic run of keeping them close, losing all these games where they gave up 10 or fewer points. The defense was pretty good, but again, how much of that was Bill Belichick or the Belichicks who have gone? And so the on paper depth chart for New England, it's not disastrous, to your point, but it's still not great relative to the rest of the league on defense. So if you're losing maybe a coaching edge on that side of the ball and you have offensive line question marks, one of the worst playmaker situations in the NFL, I think New England is in the running in this bottom 5 here as well.
Yeah, the big question mark for New England, I think, is the effect of the Belichicks, right? What impact does losing the highest ranking Belichicks have on that defense and the talent there? You sort of run down the list, and it looks not too bad, right? On the defensive side in particular. We've got all these guys that we know play quite well within this defense for Bill Belichick, but we also know that guy's got, a multi-decade track record of taking players that don't look like they should be high-end NFL starters, playing to their strengths, minimizing their weaknesses, and turning them into something better than they are outside of that New England environment. And we've seen that in both directions for years, right? Guys that come to New England after not necessarily dominating somewhere else, or guys that go away from New England after dominating there and not playing at the same kind of level. My question is simply does that immediately fall apart with him no longer pulling the strings there on defense? Because if it does, then suddenly this collection of talent might look way worse just by not having Belichick, maximizing what they do well, minimizing what they don't do well. And then the offensive side is definitely not a strong group. So if the defense suddenly starts looking way worse than it has been the last few years from an individual talent point of view, then I think you could make a compelling argument that this is the worst roster in the NFL.
All right, that's enough on the negative side. Anything else you want to talk about the worst teams? Oh, let's flip it to the best teams, unless you have something else here.
No, looking at, I think part of what I was saying, that it's actually quite hard to find teams with a terrible roster. The Chargers are 25th on this team, on this list or something. Washington, who have a ton of talent and just added a bunch, this offseason, are 27th. You can find teams that you expect to be reasonably good this year way down at the bottom end of this. I think that just sort of says this is a very high floor in terms of how bad a roster is right now in today's NFL.
Yep, just to reiterate, it does seem like the team building across the NFL has gotten better. But every year there's going to be a team that has 2 or 3 wins, right? There'll be a team that ends up at the bottom, but I think overall teams have done a better job in the offseason. We'll talk about some of those teams that end up in the middle or the interesting teams. Let's go to the top. And, coming off of our last exercise, which was ranking the top 3 players on each team, AFC and NFC. If you didn't see that, go check those out from last week. We went through the AFC and the NFC in 2 separate shows, talking about the top 3 players on each team. And the team where it was by far the most difficult selecting just a top 3 was the number 1 team in the roster rankings here, the San Francisco 49ers. As you look through it and think about all of the star power that they have, this looks like the clear slam dunk best team in the NFL from a roster standpoint. It's the Niners.
Yeah, I would say so. Certainly, the star power that they have, the high end is ridiculous. That exercise we did of trying to just identify their 3 best players was crazy, particularly relative to most other teams on the roster. The assembly of skill position players in particular that they've got is absolutely nuts. Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle. You throw in Trent Williams as the best left tackle in the NFL. You throw in Nick Bosa, a genuine defensive player of the year candidate in any given season. Fred Warner, the best linebacker in the NFL. The high end is absolutely crazy. There are holes, though. It's not like this is top to bottom. There's no weaknesses at all. There's some areas that you don't necessarily love, particularly in terms of depth. We've been talking about the offensive line needing work for years. Again, with the caveat that the Kyle Shanahan system hides deficiencies on the offensive line like nothing else.
Yeah, I think it's tough in these things. You're trying to how do they weigh quarterbacks here? I think we always have to weigh the quarterback. It's not just a simple, unit by unit breakdown. I don't know how much they weighed QBs in this whole thing, and it's tough to separate the players from the coaches, right? The Chiefs are number 2 on the ranking here. I think if you're just looking at the talent on the team, the Chiefs would be a little bit lower, much like they were last year. But it's tough to separate, the Mahomes factor, the Andy Reid factor, and Spags. You got Spags over there as well, Sam, tying it all together. I think it's harder for me to put the Chiefs up that high. But even when you're looking at the Niners, the pure talent, again, it's tough to separate Deebo Samuel from the fact that Kyle Shanahan is the one pulling the strings, putting Deebo Samuel in position to succeed here. But when you just look at the talent, I think the Niners are the team. There are other teams that would be competing there. All that said, are the Niners a tick worse than they were last year? You know, I think the defensive line has lost a little bit of depth. I look at it both ways. The offensive line that we keep questioning, they're not disastrous, and they're all coming back, and they're all adding a year of experience from an O-line perspective. That means a lot. And I mentioned on the Top 3 show, Brock Purdy's heading into year 3. And if we just look at it through the lens of Brock Purdy heading into year 3 and what he's done in his first 2 seasons, that's in the Niners' favor, that he'll continue to progress and get better. I guess my question is, did they lose a little bit of depth on that defensive line? But overall, I think the Niners look like the best roster in the NFL, as I've said.
Yeah, I mean, I think so the way to factor in coaching, in my opinion, is it's only relevant. It's not relevant in abstract terms, right? So we know Kyle Shanahan basically improves everything on the 49ers roster. And therefore, there are players on this roster that we think outside of the Shanahan environment probably wouldn't look as good, fare as well, play as well, be thought of as highly. But since the two of them are together for this season, which is the only way of measuring this, like after the fact, it doesn't matter, right? Whereas with New England and Belichick departing, like the same thing is true on the defensive side with Belichick. There are players that will look better with Belichick as their coach, but he's no longer there. So that, I think, is where you start to look at it and say, all right, now you've disconnected the head coach or the coach and the player. Now we actually need to start looking at whether that talent exists independent of the coaching, or if it's only when you put them together, you get this version of the player. So when you look at, the impact that Andy Reid has on the Chiefs, the impact that Shanahan has on the 49ers, to me, it doesn't matter whether, how much of the Brock Purdy success is Brock Purdy, how much of it is the receiving help, how much of it is Kyle Shanahan. That's its own interesting intellectual exercise, but for the purposes of roster, how good is the roster, it doesn't matter because they're all playing there together this year. They're all contributing. The sum of those is the important part for how good this roster is, not necessarily which individual piece is the driving force behind that. That's only relevant if you break that up and it's no longer collective anymore.
All right, so what about number 2 here? On the site, we've got we have Jim and Dalton doing the rankings. They had the final say on this. They put the Chiefs at 2. Do you agree with that, or is there someone else that you would slot in there as the second best roster?
No, I think there's a few rosters that I would put over Kansas City.
I agree.
I think you have a danger of sort of falling into the narrative that you use over and over again. And it's like when you have Andy Reid, Patrick Mahomes, they've been built off star power, right, for years. And for a few years, you're like, this roster actually isn't amongst the best in the NFL, but they're the best in the NFL at a couple of really important positions. Now, last season, I think that was probably not true anymore. I think last season's roster was actually crazy good, except wide receiver. And the wide receiver thing almost came back to bite them throughout the season. This year, maybe they've split the difference, and it's not quite where it was a few years ago, where it was basically, Patrick Mahomes and a few other star players dragging this relatively average roster to Super Bowls. And I don't think it's as good as it was a year ago, albeit they should have upgraded at wide receiver, which was their single biggest weakness last year. So I think it's a good roster, but I don't think it's amongst the very best in the NFL.
Yeah, I think they're in the top 5. I still think they're in the top 4 or 5. I think, and I agree with you. That was probably the best all-around Chiefs team that they've had of the Mahomes era. Maybe they underachieved a little bit at tackle, I think,
right,
and then receiver, as you mentioned, and they're still really good. I've been doing a lot of draft studies over the last few years. No team has brought in more PFF WAR, no more solid players, well above average starters than the Chiefs and Cowboys, since 2017. They're the best, and this is just not. I'm just looking at non-QBs. So in addition to having Mahomes, of course, and having Andy Reid, and the way we've seen Spags game plan in the playoffs, they are adding a lot of talent around those guys. So the Chiefs deserve mention. I think they're certainly in the mix. I'm considering the Lions here, though, as the second best roster. And part of that's projecting their cornerback situation. They're at 6 here on the PFF.com roster rankings. But I look at that team, and we've given them so much credit on this show over the last few years, how they've built it piece by piece, brick by brick. This offseason, getting even deeper on the defensive line. Are there some question marks at cornerback this year? Yes, but they addressed them with Carlton Davis in a trade, with Terry and Arnold in the draft. I think the Lions have a chance to get up there. And look, they're in the NFC Championship with the Niners. I think the Lions have a chance to be up there with the Niners, fighting for that top spot. So I like the Lions at number 2.
I don't know that there's a better roster in the NFL than the Lions right now. Like, they would be absolutely – I would have them either 1 or 2 on my roster rankings. I think the Lions really, really is a good roster. Like, they've done a phenomenal job of patching up holes, of addressing their biggest weaknesses, of attacking areas that haven't been as good. And they've got, I don't think there's a clear weakness. Now, you can look at it, corner you mentioned as, that's an area that potentially isn't as good as some others. But it's not like an obvious hole right now. It's like they've got one proven good quality starter in Carlton Davis. Terry and Arnold was, arguably cornerback number 1, cornerback 2, whatever way you want to look at it in this draft. It shouldn't be a weakness. Now, we know rookie corners don't always hit the ground running, and it might still be a problem. And then Brian Branch, obviously manning the slot, who's a really high-level player. So of your 3 starting cornerbacks, 2 of them should be minimum solid, and the third is just only a question mark because he's a rookie. But if he's as good as some rookies have been in recent years, it could be a massive strength. Like, they've overhauled the defensive line. You bring in DJ Reader, you bring in Marcus Davenport. Okay, he's still a bit of a gamble given what we've seen from him, but this is a really, really good roster.
I'm always a sucker for the Marcus Davenport ad, especially when there's not a ton of pressure on him. Maybe it's more of a rotational role. Maybe you get James Houston back.
Right.
It's still a bit of a question if they could rush the passer consistently opposite Aiden Hutchinson, but they've definitely made the moves to make that better. And then that receiving core, the way they've come together. And if Dan Campbell's telling the truth that Jameson Williams is ready to break out, in addition to Amon-Ra St. Brown and Sam Laporta and Jahmyr Gibbs, the amount of special, just unique type playmakers that they have there, I think we mentioned that going into last season. They were going to be able to attack defenses in a whole bunch of different ways, and they did that. And then, we're not talking coaching here, but Ben Johnson's back as well. And,
right.
To your point earlier, we know that he's the one pulling the strings, right? We know that he's the one getting the most out of these players as well. It doesn't hurt having that continuity.
Well, that goes into the Jared Goff conversation, right? It's like, how good is Jared Goff in a vacuum? Probably not as good as a lot of other quarterbacks, but Jared Goff plus Ben Johnson is a slightly different proposition, and that's what we're dealing with this year. We don't have to take away Ben Johnson and say, oh, what's Jared Goff going to do this year? We are pretty confident you're going to get a good season of Jared Goff because the offensive coordinator stayed in the building.
All right, number 3, roster rankings, PFF.com. It's the Philadelphia Eagles. I agree. I'd have the Eagles in this range. I think I'd have them or the Chiefs, I think, competing for that 3rd spot. What are your thoughts on the Eagles and their ranking here?
So I think this is still a good roster. I do, however, have many more questions about it than I have had in the last couple of years. Like, the Eagles have been a team, I think, that have been in the sharp end of this roster ranking for a few years now. They have got a lot more question marks on the defensive side in particular. And this feels a little bit like the Bengals from a couple of years ago, where they've done a really good job of future-proofing and identifying, where they're going to lose players, where they're going to have to plug in new young players to pick up the slack, aging guys that have either already departed, guys like Fletcher Cox retiring, on the other side. So they've lost Jason Kelce, who obviously got all the attention on the offensive side, but Fletcher Cox retired at the same time, right? So 2 of their sort of stalwarts in the trenches on either side of the ball have gone in the same offseason. Now's when they need, Jordan Davis or Jalen Carter to step up on that defensive side. But so far, a lot of the guys they've plugged in to be the continuity guy, the replacement, the successor, hasn't gone well, right? Like, Nakobe Dean was supposed to be that a year ago, and injuries meant that we just didn't see it. the cornerbacks. Now we might need Quinyon Mitchell to step in and be that guy right away. And similar to Detroit, he might be. I mean, he was consensus cornerback 1 or 2, whichever. If you went Arnold number 1, you had Mitchell number 2. If you went Mitchell number 1, it was usually Arnold number 2. So it might be fine or it might be a problem. I think, there's just more questions than there used to be.
We've got the secondary. What became a big. This is the challenge here with the Eagles. I guess they're toying with moving James Bradbury around and moving him out off of corner at this point in his career. The challenge I have is the collapse that they had last year. It's the same talent, right? Last year going into the season, the Eagles, we probably ranked them as the best roster, if I remember correctly, going into the year, at least 1 or 2. And they just absolutely collapsed last year. And they looked just disastrous on the defensive side of the ball. So again, let's go to this. How do you separate coaching and from the players? The players were the same team pretty much that went to the Super Bowl. Last year at this time we said, Cam Jurgens has to step in and start. It's right. Like, all right, if that's the only big question that you have, it's not bad. But all of a sudden they looked old in the secondary. They couldn't communicate. Guys were running free all over the place. There was in-house fighting but with the coaching staff. So if you could separate that a little bit, have they made the right moves? You're right. I mean, there's a little bit of do they actually have the right linebackers? I don't know. They're probably worse than they were a couple years ago. Are the young players going to be able to step up and take pressure off of Slay and Bradbury, who had been so good for that year and a half basically for the Eagles? So yeah, there are definitely some question marks there, but they have intriguing pieces to replace those guys, especially in the secondary with the first and second round pick, Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean. So love what the Eagles have done from a roster standpoint. It will be on Vic Fangio, Kellen Moore, both sides of the ball to just make everything better, because it did seem like the failure last year for Philly was the coaching, offensive and defensive. They didn't have answers for the blitz on offense. It looked like they couldn't even recognize a route combination in the second half of the season. Guys were running free. The linebackers looked old and slow and out of place, and they weren't even necessarily old and slow. They were just always out of place. So to me, that's the big question. But when you're just looking on paper, where do the Eagles stack up? Strong in the right spots, and as always, deep on the defensive line, and still one of the better rosters in the NFL.
Yeah, the only other issue for Philly is I think their depth isn't as strong as it used to be. Wide receiver, say you've got A.J. Brown, you've got Devontae Smith. Those are still both great. You've got one of the top wide receivers in the NFL. You got one of the top number 2 wide receivers in the NFL. But then with Devontae Parker retiring, like immediately you run out of proven commodities at wide receiver. If either one of those guys gets hurt, you've got potential issues. Now you're down to a couple of rookies coming in, Johnny Wilson or Aeneas Smith. Paris Campbell is on the roster as well. And then the offensive line as well. Now that we're going to have to reshuffle, replace Jason Kelsey, Cam Jurgens will step in and play there. But now immediately that offensive line no longer has the depth. The starting 5 should still be okay, even with one question mark at guard. But if an injury hits anywhere on that offensive line, you run out of the depth that they've had in previous years. So I think just across the board, as a product of this, struggling to replace those starters, I think Philadelphia's roster depth isn't as good as it used to be.
All right, number 4 over at PFF.com. The New York Jets, 4th best roster. Agree or disagree with this one, Sam? When we were going through our exercise, we said, yeah, their top 3 was pretty clear, but they probably had 5 guys who could all be in that mix. What do you think about the Jets being here at 4?
I think this is a really good roster still. We tend to view it, I think, not unfairly, but we view it in negative light because of what happened last year. But they went from, having theoretically an all-pro level quarterback to having one of the worst, if not the worst, quarterback starters in football. And that's, and even with that, they still, flirted with the playoffs for most of the season. So they've upgraded the offensive line significantly. You bring in 3 new starters and a contingency for the 1 new starter that's always going to be injured at some point during the season, with Fashanu backing up Tyron Smith at left tackle. So the weakest part of last year's roster got a significant overhaul, and you're getting Aaron Rodgers back again. In theory, I think it is one of the top rosters in the NFL.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, look, you steal a Morgan Moses at right tackle. Just that move alone helps move that roster forward. This is all contingent upon the injury situation, of course, right? I mean, we're looking at depth charts. We're factoring in depth, but even with Tyron Smith, maybe iffy. Can he actually play over 1,000 snaps? Can he make it through a 17-game schedule? Yeah, but you have Olu Fashanu as a backup, who I think can step in and hold his own at left tackle, at least in pass protection as a rookie. Mike Williams coming off of injury, so I mean, if it depends on these guys staying healthy. Of course, that's true for everybody, but they specifically brought in older, injury-prone type of players like Mike Williams, like Tyron Smith, Aaron Rodgers coming off the Achilles. So yeah, on paper, this does look like an outstanding roster. A little bit of turnover on the defensive side of the ball with Bryce Huff out, but Hassan Reddick in, right? They're still going to be loaded up front, able to rush the passer. And they have 2 straight years of playing really good defense. It is difficult to keep up that consistency and play lights out defense year over year. But I think the offense will be better. They don't have to be as good defensively. They still have all the same pieces. I'm just saying, even if they face a little bit of natural regression on that side of the ball, obviously having Rodgers back with some of these playmakers, better offensive line should offset that. So yeah, I agree the Jets are in this mix. I don't know if I have them at 4. They might be more 5 or 6 for me with some of the other teams. I like the Lions ahead of them. And, it's the Chiefs who I mentioned, so I'd probably bump the Jets down a little bit, but they're definitely in the range here to be one of the better rosters in the NFL.
And by the way, they've upgraded a backup quarterback as well. I mean, their season still likely hinges on whether Aaron Rodgers can move on his Achilles or not. But if they do have to turn to the backup for an extended period of time, Tyrod Taylor's a better backup than Zach Wilson was.
By the way, just as a quick aside, do you think teams, especially with older quarterbacks, would ever just sit a quarterback, like just load manage?
Right.
An older quarterback. Would you ever just start Tyrod Taylor? I don't know if it's going to happen this year, but in the future with the 17-game schedule, just if you have a good enough backup, just give the extra rest to the older quarterback. I think it might be worth considering, especially if the Jets are in a decent spot, down the stretch.
I don't know if you're ever going to purely load manage simply because, there's so few games relative to other sports that it's kind of taking the piss to be like, look, you've got 17 games and we're going to give you 4 of them off just because we can, right? It just seems crazy. But I do think that you can easily err on not even the side of caution, but your body's really banged up this week. Don't worry about it. This is a Tyrod game. You don't even have to think about it. But that kind of you need to be really, really good because you still need, most of the time, you still need to win those games, right? You either need to be completely cool with, we only need to make the playoffs. Seeding is irrelevant. We don't care what number we are. If we just make a wild card spot, we're happy. The important part is the postseason. Just getting there is the only goal for the regular season. And maybe we're reaching that point, right, where teams are actually going to be focused on that. Honestly, outside of that number 1 seed, the rest of it is not irrelevant, but it's far less important anyway. So in a landscape where there's a ton of teams vying for that number 1 seed, maybe it is more important to keep your aging quarterback upright than it is to have him out there every single week trying to secure the number 1 seed that you might not get anyway. But you would have to be cool with that, and then you would have to be really careful the games that you're essentially voluntarily playing a backup.
All right, I'm going to start going out of order here because, look, as I mentioned, I think the Jets are in the mix for the top 5. But there's a team way lower down in this list that I would put ahead of them. And they're ranked number 9, and that's the Dallas Cowboys.
Okay.
They're at number 9 in the article. I would still have the Cowboys in the top 5. And that's, to me, it's all about perspective, Sam. And the 2 things that I think skew the perspective with the Cowboys is inability to win a big game. So it's all right, we forget how much talent they have because they're not, getting to an NFC championship with this talented roster. And then second, the ebbs and flows of the offseason. Because Dallas hasn't made any aggressive moves this offseason, it's just like 2 off seasons ago for Dallas. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like they're putting themselves in position to succeed. They're not filling some of the glaring holes on that roster, at least not well. They're filling them with, okay, question marks. Tyler Guyton in the first round at left tackle, a third round potential center in Cooper Beebe. But they're still really good. And the Cowboys, I think, are still in the top 5 or so when it comes to their roster.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's the perception. It's because they've probably gotten worse that we're really dragging them down, right? It's like, yeah, but they're probably getting worse from one of the best rosters in the NFL. Like, it's important to sort of understand what the starting point was before you sort of drag them down too much for declining in the offseason. I think they probably have gotten worse heading into this year relative to even ending last season, but at the start of last season. But it is still a really good roster, and like a lot of some other teams, it's strong in the right places. I mean, Dak Prescott had a strong MVP case last season. CeeDee Lamb is one of the top 3 wide receivers in the NFL based off last season. Trayvon Diggs and Deron Bland have each had an absurd season, leading the league in interceptions and big plays from cornerback. And Micah Parsons might be the best pure football player in the NFL. Like, elite pass rusher. He'd be an elite linebacker if you played him there. Just a phenomenal player, period. They are strong at the most important. Like, that's literally ticking off 4 of the 5 most important positions in football.
Yeah, and as I was mentioned in the recent draft history, Cowboys, Chiefs, Lions, those Ravens, those are all the best teams at drafting and bringing in solid starters, solid or better starters, and then you have a Micah Parsons, so like you said, an elite starter. So the way the Cowboys have drafted over the last 5 or 6 years is actually really good. We're very critical of some of their moves. I've mentioned, when they draft for need instead of drafting the best players, maybe they miss a little bit, but those guys are still carrying things. The other part that feels uncomfortable for the Cowboys is those 3 stars are unsigned. So you and I, we love to look at things from a big picture team building standpoint. I don't know what they're going to do with Dak, with Micah Parsons, with CeeDee Lamb, all needing to get paid. So I don't know if they've future-proofed the roster very well. And did they take a bit of a step back since last year? I think so, right? Michael Gallup's out the door. Tyron Smith is out the door. Tyler Biadasz out the door, starting center. So there are starters missing. Call Gallup a starter as, wide receiver 3. There are starters missing from last year. And last year's offseason, they did a better job of shoring those things up, right? They got Stephon Gilmore for almost nothing. They brought in Brandon Cooks for almost nothing. So when they had issues on the roster last year, they got a couple proven veterans who ended up playing pretty good football for them last year. This year, they've done it through the draft. So there are more question marks this year than last year, I would say, for the Cowboys. But we're talking about a team that is a perennial 12-win type of team, and talent-wise is among the best in the league. So I think, for the Cowboys, I'd have them in the mix, probably in the top 5, and I still think maybe above the Jets, who were ranked 4th here.
So let's jump back to the PFF top 5, because they had the Ravens at number 5, right, as the final team.
Yeah.
And then there's one team that I think belongs in the top 5 and is way down this list. I was amazed.
Is it the Dolphins?
No. So Baltimore Ravens are the 5th team in the PFF ranking.
Discuss.
Yeah, I mean, another strong roster. I'm not criticizing this one too much. Obviously, Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry. The weakness we've talked about is still at wide receiver. We don't really know what that's going to look like this season, with Zay Flowers and Rashad Bateman still sort of theoretical more than practical in terms of how good they can be. The offensive line, they tore that down and sort of rebuilt it over the course of this offseason. That's a bit of a question mark relative to the last couple of years. And then the defense, should be strong, but still has some sort of weak links as well, or some potential holes. So a good, not a great roster, I think.
Yeah, the same argument I'm using to defend the Cowboys, I'm probably going to use it against the Ravens. It feels worse than last year because of the offensive line turnover. They lose Morgan Moses, right? I mean, the whole roster, the Jets jumped the Ravens because of Morgan Moses. If you flip Morgan Moses back to the Ravens, boom, they're above the Jets. No, really. But I think in the back of my mind, the same coaching stuff that has us elevating the Chiefs or the Niners or the Lions because we know they have that continuity. The Ravens have the opposite. No continuity from a coaching standpoint, at least on the defensive side of the ball. Mike McDonald is out. You have the offensive line turnover. It is tough to argue with the sea of green, as I like to say, on the defense. PFF grades of green across the board last year. Do they have they're not lacking in star power. Kyle Hamilton, Roquan Smith, relative to their positions. You could argue Justin Madubuike at defensive tackle, but they just have few weaknesses on that side of the ball. But to your point, the receiver question mark, OBJ wasn't great last year. He was fine, but it looked cleaner when it's OBJ with Zay Flowers, with Rashad Bateman. So they need a breakout there from somebody. So yeah, I think the Ravens are probably a tick below where we have them ranked at 5. I'd drop them a little bit just because of some of these question marks that they have this year, maybe versus last year.
And then the team that I think is a top 5 roster is ranked number 12 in the PFF rankings, the Cleveland Browns. I think this is a good enough roster, top to bottom, that they don't even need Deshaun Watson to play at the level we keep talking about. Like, go back to that, pre-COVID Deshaun Watson with Houston. I don't think they even need him to play anything like that. This roster is good enough that they can make the playoffs, even with him just playing halfway average football. Like, I think this is one of the best rosters in the NFL. The addition of Jerry Jeudy, underachieving as he's been, like that group of Amari Cooper, Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore should be a really good wide receiver group, even if it's, even if they don't have, there's no Justin Jefferson, there's no CeeDee Lamb, there's no absolute superstar there. But I think that's a really good trio. It gets even better when you factor in David Njoku at tight end as well, who particularly on the second half of last season was absolutely phenomenal. The offensive line is one of the best in the NFL with some depth as well. Like DeJuan Jones probably isn't going to start and yet could be. The defensive line is sort of still the rebuilt version of the defensive line from a year ago that was so much better than it was prior to that. JOK at linebacker, Jordan Hicks coming in at linebacker as well. That group of cornerbacks, Greg Newsome, Martin Emerson, Denzel Ward. Like, this is one of the best rosters in the league. At 12, I mean, you have to A, be valuing quarterback really high, and B, think Deshaun Watson just stinks now to put them at 12.
Yeah, I was about to say, if you just forgot the quarterbacks for a minute, this roster does look similar to the Lions, does it not? I'm not saying pure roster construction, the same exact position groups, but when you talk about depth, it's still one of the better offensive lines, much like the Lions. It's a similar group of receivers as the Lions. The defensive line's probably better than Detroit. The secondary is probably better than Detroit as far as proven players go. But it's similar across the board as far as when you go unit by unit, there's not a whole lot of weaknesses on the Cleveland Browns. And then the X factor, if you were just comparing those two rosters as I am, Jared Goff versus Deshaun Watson. One guy has played far better over the last couple of years, and that's Jared Goff. And we don't know exactly what Deshaun Watson's going to give. I mean, look, did Joe Flacco kind of play out of his mind last year off the couch? But maybe we're undervaluing that whole aspect of things. I know from a storyline perspective, they won games with 5 starting quarterbacks last year, was it? The Browns? 4 or 5? I mean, Kevin Stefanski has done a great job, wins coach of the year, but maybe we're not even valuing that enough. The fact that Joe Flacco came off the couch, got away with some turnover-worthy plays, but he was aggressive and attacked down the field, and they made a little run. They made a run, and, they got beat up pretty bad in the playoffs, but yeah, I'm with you, man. I think roster-wise, the Browns have done an outstanding job these last couple of years, and they should be a little bit closer to the top 5. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, to me, they're one of the best rosters in the NFL. I mean, I think 1 and 2 is San Francisco, Detroit in some order, but Cleveland could be 3 for me.
I think so. You want them up as high as 3. I don't know if I'd put them up that high because the teams that I have in the top 5, let's say 49ers, Lions, Eagles, Chiefs, I would say probably top 4 for me. And who did I put it? And then Cowboys 5. All of those teams are far more secure at quarterback. The worst quarterback of that group, you're battling between Jalen Hurts and Jared Goff. And we're talking, Watson hasn't been good since the lockdown year. right? So that's an issue for the Browns. And so for me, it probably puts them closer to seven or eight, because, who are they going to leapfrog? Some of these other teams, the Houston Texans are at 7. Sorry, let me go to 6. I'm sorry, we have the Lions at 6. We'll get the Texans at 7, the Bengals at 8, Cowboys at 9, who I said earlier, Bills at 10. We can debate about the Bills here in a minute, and Dolphins at 11. It's tough to leapfrog some of those teams because the quarterback situation is such a big factor.
But it has to be like your ranking has to be like Kansas City is a better football team because they have Patrick Mahomes, right? But I don't think it's a better roster than the Cleveland Browns, unless you factor in like quarterback is everything, and unless I have a high-level quarterback, I simply cannot have a high-level roster. But like the players, certainly players 2 through 53 for Cleveland are dramatically better than Buffalo. Like the only argument for putting Buffalo ahead of Cleveland as a roster ranking is that Josh Allen is dramatically better than Deshaun Watson right now, and I factor that, 17 times the weight of anything else.
Yeah, so that's where I was going to go with this. Is Buffalo at 10. I would drop them a bit, and I'm going to be a Bills advocate this season when it comes to that team, and the fact that I still think they're going to be one of the best teams in the AFC, and I don't think that their Super Bowl window closed or whatever. But it still looks like a team that has a chance to take a step back before it takes a step forward, and it looks a little worse than last year. And that's fine. They're younger. They have more question marks, right? It's more questions. Maybe Keon Coleman's a stud. Maybe all of the Tre'Davious White replacements, Benford will do fine, like he did. Rasul Douglas will continue to play great. Maybe all of the replacements for the seeming, not the stars, but like they're locked in solid starters that are out the door. Maybe they'll be okay. Maybe Von Miller bounces back. But it is tough, I think, to put the Bills above even just the Dolphins at 11 in their own division. I think the Dolphins have more firepower top to bottom than a team like the Bills.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I also think like Cleveland, okay, we could debate Baltimore maybe, but I think Cleveland clearly have a better roster than Cincinnati does. Like the Bengals roster, I think quite quickly you look at that group and start getting concerned by potential weak spots or holes in that roster. And the only thing that's making you feel good about Cincinnati is, well, they've still got Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, so it'll be fine, right? But the roster itself, I don't think is in great shape, certainly relative to like Cleveland. Again, the only argument for having them above is Joe Burrow is a lot better than Deshaun Watson right now.
Yeah, I like Cincinnati's roster overall, though. I mean, I think they're fine in that top 10 mix. It would be interesting if we did just say take the quarterback out of it. Like
right.
if you were able to be disciplined and take the QB out of it. But I do think that the receiver room of Chase and Higgins as a starting point is huge. The offensive line being back, again, seemingly improved, looks like the offense is one of the better ones in the NFL for Cincinnati. And then defensively, do I have some question marks for, pass rush help for Trey Hendrickson or losing a DJ Reader? Absolutely. I think the simple adjustment of having Von Bell and Geno Stone in there at safety is going to help that defense quite a bit. The cornerback room maybe has some questions. So yeah, there are some questions there, but I like the Bengals roster overall. But certainly having a healthy Joe Burrow sitting atop that makes it, closer to, roster 8 like we have listed here.
Like the star power and the depth of that defense compared with Cleveland's defense, I think is night and day. I mean, the Browns at almost every single position are significantly better than even at the star power. Like the best player on the Bengals defense right now is Trey Hendrickson, and he's not as good as Myles Garrett. And the depth at every other spot is better on Cleveland's defense as well. So yeah, like you can paint a world where the optimal version of this Bengals defense plays okay, but again, like Philadelphia earlier, the players that they've identified to come in and take on bigger roles so far have not done a great job of that. Notably, Dax Hill and DJ Turner, those two guys, the two defensive backs who are like Dax Hill was sort of identified to step into a bigger role last year. DJ Turner is going to need to do it this year. There's no evidence yet that either one of those guys is going to be a plus player for this defense, and now they need them to be.
All right, you've made your Browns point, Sam.
Okay.
Put them in the top 5. I put the Cowboys in the top 5. You're putting the Browns in the top 5. Who else stands out here as a... So I'm going to make the case for the Dolphins here.
Okay.
Being closer to 6, 7, or 8 than 11. Again, they're... Same argument I made with the Cowboys. Stuttering through my words. Jim and Dalton have the Cowboys at 9, the Dolphins at 11. And for me, it is tough to get out of my head the on-paper championship that it looks like these teams are winning, or the September championship it seems like these teams are winning. The Dolphins had most yards through 5 weeks last year, Sam. That was the record. There is a little bit of flash and dash to the Dolphins and the Cowboys, a little bit of front runner to both of those teams. I have a tough time putting that aside, where they put up a ton of points. When it comes down to playoff time or facing good teams, both teams struggled. There was so many similarities, I think, between Miami and Dallas last year. But for this exercise of on-paper champions, the Dolphins have to be a lot higher, in my opinion, especially with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, with Tua running the show, the offensive line. Yeah, there's some questions there, but again, the Mike McDaniel and the scheme factor they can manage. All that speed that they have. And look, they got depleted on the defensive side last year from an injury standpoint. If they stay healthy, this should be a good defense. And then apparently they hated Vic Fangio, right?
Yeah.
And that's the tough thing. As an analyst, Sam, it's really tough for us to know that Vic Fangio historically is a really good football coach, and we think, oh, he's going to a team that has a lot of talent, including Jalen Ramsey, who looks like a perfect fit schematically, and we didn't know the team just hated Vic Fangio, and so did Jalen. Ramsey hated Vic Fangio, and it just wasn't a good fit. And just that, addition by subtraction, might help this defense, which again is extremely talented.
Do you think that's like a Miami vibes type of thing? Like that wasn't a thing everywhere else Vic Fangio's been. Like when you're...
No, I don't think this is like a thing if you go back through Vic's history that nobody likes him, because the Eagles are excited to have Vic Fangio.
But what I'm saying is when you are applying your trade in Chicago and Denver and Philadelphia, these are places that are already hard-working, miserable, cold-ass places in the winter, whereas Miami is still party time and 70-degree weather and palm trees, right? Is that what's happening here? Is that Vic Fangio's, hard-nosed football persona doesn't work in Miami in December when people just still want to chill on the beach?
It sounds ridiculous, and I used to hate that idea that like the teams, the city and the identity but there's probably something to it.
Yeah.
There's probably something to it. Like, nah, coach, we don't want to play defense. We're in Miami. We don't want to. Of course, the Dolphins want to play defense at some point, right. But hey, even Nick Saban couldn't win in Miami.
Lighten up, be less of a dick about it. Like, let's just we want to be professional, but you don't have to yell at us. It's sunny out.
Yell at us, it's sunny. But you can yell in Chicago,
right?
It works in Chicago.
People expect you to yell in Chicago. It's cold.
It's cold and dreary. Anyway, yeah. My big concern with Miami is the interior of the defensive line. I think losing Christian Wilkins could be a big loss. Not only his durability, but just overall talent. They're a little depleted there, but they got a slew of pass rushers, speed on both sides of the ball, as we've mentioned. The secondary could be really good. I mean, if you get the best of Kendall Fuller, the best of Jalen Ramsey, I know those guys are getting older, but Javon Holland being one of the better safeties in the NFL, Jordan Poyer coming in, I mean, that could be one of the best secondaries in the NFL if they put it all together there. So I think Miami should be a little higher on this list.
Yeah, I mean, my concern for Miami is just it's both trenches, essentially. Like the interior, the defensive line without Christian Wilkins.
That's okay. They're in Miami.
Right.
It's hot. Nobody wants to, destroy blocks or anything like that. It's Miami.
Obviously, the edge rushers all got injured last season, which means they're all coming off injuries this season. And the guys that they brought in to sort of supplement that are either also coming off injury or are rookies, Chop Robinson, Mohamed Kamara. So that's still very much a question mark, like the pass rush for this team. Where is it coming from? And then the offensive line, again, the caveat, Mike McDaniel. But Teron Armstead is good. but you're guaranteed to miss 25% of the season with Teron Armstead. Now, they've backfilled that Patrick Paul in the draft, but it's less of a comfortable backfill than the Tyron Smith, Olu Fashanu one that the Jets did. And then, like, the rest of this offensive line just doesn't look good. They lost their second best player in Robert Hunt in the offseason. And, like, I mean, if you didn't know the offense that this offensive line was attached to, right? If you didn't know that it was going to get protected by the Mike McDaniel fastest average time to throw in the NFL Tua type of thing, you would be really concerned by this offensive line. It's only that you know that's working behind it that you're like, okay, it's probably going to be okay, but it's not good.
Because we've seen them operate, right? We've seen them operate with a similar line, with that similar group of players. So, other interesting teams. Texans are ranked 7th here on our roster rankings. Is that about the right spot for Houston?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is a good roster. I don't think it's great yet, but it's definitely sort of pushing that top 5.
There are theories in the NFL, and I want to find the exact numbers. I'm going to try to do one similar, where you want to have X number of high-end players, you know, whether you call them blue chips or stars or Pro Bowl potential. And a lot of times you're looking at, you want to have 6, 7, 8 guys that are carrying your team. And it almost looks like Houston is subscribing to that theory the way they've built their team the last couple of years. Of course, I don't know if they deserve all the credit for drafting CJ Stroud at 2, but you know, they're thankful that they got him, right? But they've got Stroud. They went up to go get Will Anderson. There's another star. They went out and get Danielle Hunter this offseason. There's another star. They go get Stephon Diggs this offseason, another star, in addition to Nico Collins becoming one of those guys last year. So this receiver trio of Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs, Tank Dell, Stroud throwing them the ball, Laramie Tunsil at left tackle. I mean, if you're just looking at the high-end starters that they have on this team, Derek Stingley, the way he played last year, plus that draft pedigree, they've got 7 or 8 guys that you could say, hey, these guys are among the best at their position. And I think Houston has specifically gone out and gotten those types of players, the complete opposite of what they did a few years ago, but that's why they're high here on these roster rankings.
Yeah, no, I think it's legit. One other team I wanted to bring up because I think they're an interesting one to talk about. Number 13, Green Bay. Second year in a row going into the season as the youngest roster in the NFL. I think that makes them very difficult to rank because you're not sure how good those guys are going to be with another year of development, right? Like, are they all going to take this big step forward together, in which case they could be the best roster in football? Or, you know, what's the baseline of that development going to be for an incredibly deep group of young players?
So maybe I'm just going to repeat all my Packers lines from last year. Going into last season, they were very young, had a lot of upside, and I said, next year at this time, we're going to be talking about the Packers. And we are. We absolutely are talking about the Packers, because if we're talking about if this roster exercise was a multi-year exercise, like who's best set up for 2025 and 26, Packers are probably top 5, right? All of these guys are going to be under contract over the next couple of years. They rework Jordan Love and figure him out, but they're not breaking the bank for a whole lot of players. And there's all sorts of promise with these. They're all second and third year players. And as I mentioned on the last show, like if Christian Watson took that big step with his healthy hamstrings to become a star this year, wouldn't be surprised, right? So they have all the makings. They're going to be a very good team. But when you go up and down the roster and say, okay, do they have a slew of elite players? Not necessarily. They just have unbelievable depth. The depth is really young. And I think in that group of depth players, like a Romeo Doubs, a Christian Watson, Zach Tom taking the next step, Rashawn Gary, plenty of these guys can take the next step and become stars, heading into this year. And that's not to take away from, like, Jair Alexander has been one of the better corners in the league over the last couple of years. Xavier McKinney is one of the best pure free safeties in the NFL. But I'm talking about the Luke Musgraves of the world, right? Like all of those guys becoming bigger household names this year. All of that stuff's on the table. It's just a matter of, okay, who are the guys? I think they're ascending. I really like them as a team. Jordan Love looked unbelievable down the stretch last year. But I also think, okay, next year at this time, we're saying, okay, they're even better, and they're cracking that top 5 from a roster standpoint once we get more information on the Packers. So I'm with you. It's tough to rank them. 13's probably fair, but they also have this, Matt LaFleur has done a really nice job there as well. They've just done a nice job. The defense should be better with coaching changes there as well. So there's a lot to like about the Packers, but I think the roster in a vacuum for this season is probably ranked in the right spot.
I just think they have such a broad range of outcomes because we have no idea how much those young guys are going to develop and how quickly. So it's like in video games where you get the kind of, here's your actual ability right now and here's your potential ability. There's that, it's sort of grayed out. So the Packers have all this extra room of potential ability, and we don't know if any of them are going to take a step towards that this year or if all of them are, or, some mixture of the two, and how far along that's going to push them. But, all those wide receivers, the young guys, like the youngest wide receiver core in the NFL last year, all those guys looked pretty good. If they all take a step forward, Tugger Kraft, right, the second tight end they drafted last year, by the end of the season, he looked like a star and the better of the two, and he might be the lesser of the talents, right? If all of those guys take this step, and Tugger Kraft's like a good player, and he's tight end too, and Musgrave, becomes a player he threatened to be in preseason and training camp, and then the wide receiver happens likewise. There's a world where this team takes a huge jump, and like the youngest roster in football is suddenly loaded with star power because a year of development together has worked wonders. There's equally a world where they're basically the same as they were a year ago. Nobody's taken a step at all.
All right, we got about 5 minutes before we wrap it up. The one other team, I'll let you highlight one team, and I'll highlight one, and we'll kind of get out of here. The Rams are at 14.
Yeah.
And again, I love saying last year at this time, very specifically at OTAs, our friend Zach Robinson was like a camp arm for the Rams, right? The QB coach, Zach, I don't remember if that was real or if we were just joking, but they had rookies everywhere, right? They didn't even have special teamers at OTAs or whatever it was, or mini camps last year. So they went from a team where it was like, hey, this is going to be fun. It's Matthew Stafford, Cooper Kupp, and Aaron Donald. And then a Senior Bowl roster. No offense to the Senior Bowl, but literally all rookies. And then they ended up being very competitive. You discovered a Puka Nacua. You have a breakout from Kyron Williams. You have a breakout. You trade for Kevin Dotson, and he becomes one of the better guards in the NFL. They locked him up. So even with Aaron Donald out, this roster and the way they've transformed it just in the last 12 months, I think is amazing. And then now they finally got to play in free agency, too, for the first time in a few years. And they brought in Darius Williams, and they bring in Tre'Davious White. So they also have just some good established players mixed in with some Packers-like young players. And it's a really nice roster for the Rams, especially given where they were last year at this time.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The Chicago Bears is the team that I would highlight. They are all the way down at number 20 in the roster rankings. And I'm less high on the defense than a lot of people, but I think the offense that they've assembled is insane. And again, it's sort of the only way of dragging it down this far, in my opinion, is the quarterback, right? And not knowing what we have yet in Caleb Williams. But that's one of the best wide receiver groups in the NFL. You add in Cole Kmet at tight end. The offensive line should be more than fine. And then the defense, it's got some question marks, but it's also got some quality players at this point, and at all three levels. Jalen Johnson, TJ Edwards at linebacker, Montez Sweat. They've now got at least one impact playmaker, Kevin Byard at safety as well, at all three levels, and then a group of young players that, similar to Green Bay, could all take a big step forward together. So I think 20 for Chicago feels harsh.
It's been fun watching their transformation over the last couple of years. We mentioned when Ryan Poles came in, cap issues, no draft capital. They flipped the script on both of those things, and especially that trio of receivers going with Caleb Williams, the talent that they've added to the defensive side of the ball. I'm with you, man. I think the Bears could be higher, and I think the Vikings could be higher. They're at 21. They could be a little bit higher. I'm not saying they're like the Browns, but it's a similar, I think when you look at the roster top to bottom, it's solid. There are more holes than the Browns. But the biggest thing holding them down is probably the questions at quarterback. They got J.J. McCarthy likely scheduled to be the starter, or Sam Darnold. I think that hurts the Vikings. But I think non-quarterback roster, I think they have done a nice job. But they might be more in like the, hey, 2 and 3 years from now, they're just really well set up compared to where they were. So I might be overrating them, but 21 felt a little bit low for the Vikings for me.
All right, do you want to wrap this up by just passing comment on the retirement of Darren Waller, tight end for the Giants? This has been sort of bubbling all offseason. It's been, I think, expected from the Giants all the way through the offseason. He's sort of finally getting around to effectively confirming it. The Giants put out a statement essentially wishing him well. Fascinating story. A 6th-round pick out of Georgia Tech and was a wide receiver back then. Georgia Tech still back then running the triple option offense, so the wide receivers were always an interesting kind of proposition, yet they sent a lot of them to the NFL from that kind of system. But Darren Waller, this huge 6'6", 250-pound wide receiver, and got to the NFL, didn't really work at wide receiver, then converted to tight end, and that's when he became this sort of breakout player for the Raiders, and was really good for a couple of years, and then injuries started to take hold. The move to New York didn't work at all. Injuries just never really cleared up. But fascinating career for a guy that had to do it by a circuitous route.
Yeah, I'm always of the mind that the elite tight end is just such a game changer for offenses, and the elite tight end being a Gronk, a Kelsey, a George Kittle, Mark Andrews. But those guys make such an impact on the offense. There's only a handful of those guys in the league at any given time, and there was a 2 to 4 year stretch where Waller was one of those guys. So I think that to me, that's what I'll remember him as. PFF WAR has him as number 3 most valuable tight end in 2019, number 2 most valuable in 2020. I remember Waller as that receiver conversion, as you mentioned. And there's a lot of those receiver conversions that just don't work, right? A guy becomes a 2nd or 3rd string tight end. They certainly don't become what Darren Waller became. An absolute game changer on that offense, though. And the Giants were hoping for something similar. He was fine, but yeah, as you mentioned, the injuries and that was music career.
Yeah,
taking off.
I know you have a hard out now, but I can't end the thing without asking you, are you growing like an early 2000s era chin beard there, or is that just some weird shadowing that's going on?
I think it's the shadowing.
Okay.
Though I shave every Sunday.
Yeah.
I may have missed a spot yesterday. Did I miss a spot?
It's just it's had this sort of like, the little like up or sideways C, the little.
No, that's a shadow. That's a shadow.
It's okay.
Look,
that's fine.
That's normal, right?
I just wondered if you were, you had a side gig as some sort of,
just
three doors
like
down
the under
band.
Almost neck beard you're looking for.
Not even the neck, just around the chin. You know what I mean? The little sort of.
No, we're not doing that.
Like the Papa Roach thing, right? That the singer from Papa Roach always had that.
Oh yeah. We're not doing that.
Okay, just checking.
Thanks for checking in on me.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's it for us today. Best rosters in the NFL. Let us know. Haven't asked you to let us know in a while what you think the best rosters are in the NFL. Drop them in the comments. And we're going to do win totals here, AFC and NFC, this Thursday, and then on Monday as well. So thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll see you again on Thursday with more PFF NFL Podcast.